Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wrestling with a relationship that is, you could argue it's the most critical and complex geopolitical dynamic of the 21st century.
Oh, absolutely.
The volatile yet deeply intertwined relationship between India and China.
It is a phenomenal area of study. And you've brought us a comprehensive stack of sources that they don't just recount history. They really demand that we apply the conceptual firepower of international relations, or IR theories, to make sense of it all.
Right. So that's our mission today. We want to use these theories as, precise conceptual tools to explain why these two rising nuclear powers constantly swing back and forth.
It's a pendulum. Friendship, intense security rivalry, and then this deep, deep economic engagement all at the same time.
Exactly. And for you, the learner, the relevance here is immediate and urgent. We're talking about more than just diplomatic history.
Much more.
Geopolitical tensions between New Delhi and Beijing, they directly impact global supply chains. They dictate where multinational companies can and cannot invest. They affect commodity flows.
And ultimately, they shape business strategy right across Asia. Understanding the structural forces driving this behavior is, it's essential for managing risk and finding opportunity.
That's the core mandate.
Right. And the fundamental problem that IR theories try to solve is explaining state behavior. Why states choose cooperation, why they choose competition, what drives them toward war.
All within this international system that's defined by one word: anarchy.
And we should be clear what we mean by anarchy.
Yeah, it's not pure chaos, not Mad Max.
Not at all. It just means the absence of a single, central, authoritative world government. There's no one to enforce laws or contracts between nations.
There's no global sheriff.
Exactly. And that absence means that states are fundamentally responsible for their own security.
Yep.
And the history of India-China relations since 1950, it's just a perfect proving ground for testing this idea.
You see everything.
We see every phase: initial fraternity, sudden war, decades of frozen mistrust, and then, remarkably, explosive economic integration. It's all there.
Okay, let's unpack this by first setting up our toolkit. I think we need to define these theoretical lenses clearly before we apply them to, border clashes and trade statistics. So let's start with the dominant paradigm in security studies. It's the heavy hitter, the one that seems to explain most of the headlines we read about conflict. Section 1.1, Realism. What is the basic fundamental worldview realism offers us?
Realism is the perpetually pessimistic but often highly pragmatic lens. Its core tenets are based on the nature of the international system.
Okay.
States are the primary actors. The system is anarchic, and therefore states are motivated above all else by survival.
Just staying alive.
Staying alive, the pursuit of power and self-help security. This inherent lack of trust makes competition the default setting.
So if anarchy forces states to prioritize survival, then power becomes the currency of the realm.
Precisely. Realism focuses squarely on hard power. The emphasis is on tangible military capability, economic resources that can be converted into military strength.
And control of strategic geography.
Yes, which in the India-China context means mountain passes, high-altitude plateaus, and maritime choke points. The goal is always the maximization of national interest, often viewed through the zero-sum lens of relative gains.
Relative gains, that's a critical distinction here. Help us unpack that idea fully.
Okay, so a realist is obsessed with relative gains because they worry about future threats.
Right.
Let's say State A and State B both grow their economy by 10%. That's an absolute gain for both, which is great. But
there's a but.
There's always a but in realism. If State A spends its gain on 5 new destroyers and State B spends it on, say, domestic social programs, State A has gained relatively more power.
I see.
The realist in State B worries less about the 10% economic growth and more about those 5 new destroyers because that increases State A's capacity to threaten State B down the road.
And that fear drives everything.
It drives rivalry, arms races, diplomatic maneuvering, everything.
And this obsession with relative power introduces two absolutely critical concepts for understanding the current India-China rivalry: the security dilemma and the balance of power.
Yes. The balance of power is the basic strategy. States form alliances and build up capabilities to prevent any single actor from achieving hegemony.
So India cooperating with the Quad, for example.
That's a classic balance of power maneuver against China. But the security dilemma, as we'll see later, is the daily reality along the line of actual control.
Explain that a bit more.
It explains how actions taken by one state solely to increase its own security, let's say building a defensive troop shelter or a road to a remote outpost, are inevitably perceived as threatening or aggressive by the rival state.
Even if they're genuinely defensive.
Even then. And this forces the rival to respond with its own counter buildup, and the cycle of suspicion, escalation, and higher defense budgets becomes entirely self-perpetuating.
So realism then tells us that as long as India and China are major powers on the same continent, this intense competition is essentially structural. It's unavoidable.
That's the realist conclusion. It focuses on the constants, geography, power differentials, and it tends to minimize the temporary variables like specific leaders or trade agreements.
But if realism paints such a structurally gloomy picture, how do we explain the explosive economic growth? I mean, the hundreds of billions of dollars in trade that connect them.
Right. You need a different lens for that.
So let's flip the coin and look at section 1.2, liberalism.
Liberalism offers a necessary counterargument. It doesn't deny that the system is anarchic, but it forcefully argues that cooperation is highly achievable even within that system.
And the way you do that is through.
The mechanisms for mitigating conflicts center on institutions, international law, and critically economic interdependence.
So when states get tangled up in each other's economies, they're less likely to fight because the cost of disruption just becomes too high.
Exactly. Trade becomes the constraint on conflict.
And liberalism focuses on the mechanisms for that cooperation.
Yes, global markets, organizations like the UN, the WTO, regional bodies, specific treaties. This theory's central goal is highlighting absolute gains.
So not who won more, but did we both win?
Precisely. States are rational, and if they can both profit from a deal, they should pursue it. The focus shifts from the zero-sum worry about who gained more power, which is the realist view, to the mutual benefit of achieving a win-win scenario, regardless of the relative advantage.
That makes profound sense in the context of globalized supply chains.
Yeah.
I mean, an Indian software firm needs components from China.
And a Chinese manufacturer needs access to the vast Indian consumer market. That mutual need creates a lobby for peace. A very powerful one.
It does.
Liberal theory also emphasizes the role of domestic politics, specifically the role of democratic governance and well-defined regimes that encourage peaceful problem-solving and transparency.
Which reduces mistrust.
It can. India's status as the world's largest democracy, while perhaps not erasing all conflict, is seen through a liberal lens as a force that favors rules-based engagement over pure military coercion.
Okay, so realism explains the military buildup. Liberalism explains the trade boom. But these theories alone, they don't explain the deep, almost personal mistrust that persists despite the trade.
No, they don't. For that, we need section 1.3, Constructivism.
This is where things get really interesting.
Constructivism is the sociological lens. It shifts the focus entirely away from economic statistics or military hardware.
To what?
It argues instead that ideas, identities, and social narratives are what fundamentally shape state behavior. Crucially, the concepts of enemy or partner are not fixed realities, they are constructed.
They're learned.
They're learned and reinforced over time through interactions and shared historical interpretation.
And this explains the psychological and historical baggage in the relationship. It explains why a policy decision might make perfect economic or military sense, but still fail spectacularly because of some historical memory.
Absolutely. Factors like national identity, historical memory, especially the memory of the 1962 war, which we'll definitely get into, and sustained political discourse, they fundamentally influence how states interpret each other's actions.
So a major road built by China could be seen as defensive.
If the history were one of continuous partnership. But given the history of the 1962 conflict, it's interpreted as an offensive staging ground. The material reality is the same. It's a road. But the interpretation is completely different.
So the aha moment for constructivism is that the material world of tanks and tariffs matters, but how we perceive that material world, the filter we put on it, ultimately determines our actions.
Exactly. The material world is always filtered through the social world of shared norms and expectations. This theory is indispensable for understanding why deep-seated mistrust and emotional responses to border incidents can instantly override those seemingly rational cost-benefit calculations that liberalism favors.
Okay, before we move to the history, we should briefly acknowledge the fourth theoretical lens in our sources. It's necessary for fully analyzing the economic power dynamics between two developing world giants.
Right, the Marxist or dependency perspectives in section 1.4.
So what does this lens offer?
This perspective offers a critical structural view, especially on economic relationships. Marxist and dependency theories stress the role of global capitalism and these entrenched core periphery structures.
Usually that means the developed world as the core dominating the developing world, the periphery. But how does this apply to India and China, two massive rising economies?
Well, it's adapted to understand how power dynamics manifest through structural economic means, even between two strong states.
I see.
This lens highlights how one state or powerful multinational firms can leverage trade, investment, and technology to dominate a weaker economy, creating these unequal relationships.
And in the India-China context,
It helps us analyze the massive, persistent, and structurally growing trade deficit India has with China. It views that trade relationship less as a liberal win-win and more as a source of long-term structural leverage for China, which only makes the political tensions worse.
we have our toolkit established. Now let's apply these lenses to the chronological story, starting with the surprising early history of friendship in section 2.1. It is genuinely difficult to remember that the early 1950s were defined by a spirit of Pan-Asian solidarity.
The contrast is jarring, isn't it? India was one of the very first nations outside the Soviet bloc to formally recognize the newly established People's Republic of China in 1950.
And this was driven by a specific vision.
Heavily driven by Prime Minister Nehru's vision of India and China as joint leaders, projecting Asian solidarity against the vestiges of Western colonialism. This set the stage for a very constructivist idea of friendship.
And the diplomatic zenith of this early relationship was the Panchsheel Agreement of 1954.
Yes, a foundational document. It officially laid out the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
Which were?
Mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence.
It sounds perfect on paper.
It did, and this rhetoric fueled the era of Hindi Chini Bye Bye, a high watermark of diplomatic and rhetorical friendship. It really suggested that a shared Asian identity could transcend traditional realist power politics.
But history took a dramatic turn. We move into section 2.2, the pivot to conflict in the late 1950s that culminated in the devastating 1962 war. What was the core failure that dismantled this fraternity so quickly?
The core failure was the clash of realist interests over undefined boundaries, hidden just beneath all that friendly rhetoric. As China asserted and consolidated control over Tibet, the boundary issue became acutely relevant.
Especially in 2 main disputed sectors.
Exactly, those sectors being Aksai Chin and the Northeast Frontier Agency. In the western sector, the area known as Aksai Chin is crucial because it facilitates China's connectivity between its Xinjiang and Tibet regions. China was quietly building strategic roads through this high-altitude territory, which India claimed.
And in the east.
In the eastern sector, the dispute was over the Northeast Frontier Agency, which is now Arunachal Pradesh. India controlled it, but China claimed it. And as the scale of China's road building became apparent in the late 1950s, the official trust, built on Panchsheel, just evaporated almost instantly.
The situation devolved into the Sino-Indian War of October-November 1962. We often hear it summarized, but what was the profound, lasting impact of that specific conflict?
It was short, it was brutal, and it was devastatingly decisive in China's favor. It was a serious Indian military setback. But the political and psychological impact was arguably more significant than the immediate military loss.
A national scar.
The sources all highlight this. A national psychological scar in India. For a political establishment that had staked its entire foreign policy on the Pai narrative and non-alignment, the sudden aggression was viewed as the ultimate betrayal.
And that trauma froze the relationship for decades.
It did. The border remained essentially frozen, diplomatic ties were severely downgraded, and the narrative of Chinese untrustworthiness became deeply embedded in the Indian psyche. This immediate jarring shift from perceived friend to aggressor created the foundational memory that Constructivism uses to explain persistent modern mistrust.
Now we jump forward to section 2.3, normalization and confidence building. The relationship was stagnant for nearly 15 years. Ambassador-level relations were only restored in 1976. What was the actual turning point that signaled a move away from the trauma?
The essential turning point, cited by virtually every analyst of this process, was Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's breakthrough visit to Beijing in 1988.
The first in a very long time.
The first visit by an Indian Prime Minister in 34 years. It signaled a clear political will on both sides to compartmentalize the border dispute, to agree to disagree, and initiate a new phase of overall relationship normalization. It was about moving past the 1962 humiliation.
So from the 1990s onward, the focus shifted from solving the core boundary dispute to simply managing the rivalry along the line of actual control, LAC.
Right, and preventing accidental conflict.
Which is a classic liberal move in the face of realist pressure.
Absolutely. Since they couldn't solve the territorial issue, a realist concern, they focused on institutionalizing stability, a liberal mechanism. This resulted in a series of crucial confidence-building measures.
The Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement.
Exactly. Signed in 1993, 1996, 2005, and 2013.
What specifically did those agreements achieve?
Well, they formalized rules of engagement along the LAC. Key provisions included mutual troop reductions, commitments not to use firearms during confrontations, and establishing protocols for handling face-offs.
The idea was to keep things from spinning out of control.
Exactly. To minimize the risk of accidental escalation and keep the competition contained, allowing the commercial relationship to flourish separately.
And that flourishing commercial relationship brings us to Section 2.4, trade boom and new tensions in the 2000s and beyond. This paradox is the defining feature of the modern relationship.
It really is. The rapid expansion of bilateral trade in the 2000s was breathtaking. China quickly became one of India's largest trading partners. This is, textbook evidence for the liberal hypothesis. Integration creates mutual wealth and stabilizes relations.
There's a cost.
Yes. This came at a cost that feeds that dependency perspective we talked about. India rapidly developed a massive, structurally ingrained trade deficit with China, making its manufacturing sector reliant on Chinese intermediate goods.
And the diplomatic friction, despite all that trade, exploded back into the open.
It did. The trust deficit, which had been latent since 1962, resurfaced with force. We saw the prolonged 2017 Doklam standoff, a very difficult confrontation at a highly sensitive tri-junction area involving India, Bhutan, and China.
But the most serious escalation was the 2020 Galwan Valley clash in Ladakh. The Galwan clash was significant because it marked a shift from coercive diplomacy to actual kinetic violence.
It was monumental. It caused the first fatalities in the border dispute since 1975. The sheer fact that soldiers died in hand-to-hand combat, reversing this decades-long commitment not to fire weapons along the LAC.
It changed everything.
It unambiguously signaled a new, far more dangerous phase in the relationship. It exposed the confidence-building agreements as fragile and demonstrated that realist security concerns still ultimately hold veto power over liberal economic interdependence.
Now we take that historical timeline and we overlay the realist lens again. When we apply realism, the entire story simplifies, doesn't it?
It does.
It's fundamentally a high-stakes rivalry between two rising great powers competing for security and regional influence in Asia, regardless of shared history or trade.
That is the core realist insight. Forget the rhetoric of Asian solidarity. The structural dynamic of the international system forces them into a competition for security.
It's just baked into the system.
It is. Both are growing powers, both seek regional dominance, and both interpret the other's actions as inherently challenging their own security interests.
And our sources highlight that this is a comprehensive power struggle. It's not just about the disputed borders in the mountains.
No, it's about every strategic move across Asia and the Indian Ocean. It's total geopolitical chess.
Give us an example.
Well, realism views China's strategic support for Pakistan, India's perennial adversary, as a classic, deliberate balancing maneuver. It's intended to tie up Indian military resources and strategic attention on its western border.
And India's response.
Conversely, India's deepening ties with the U.S. and its active role in the quadrilateral security dialogue, or the Quad, with the U.S., Japan, and Australia, are interpreted by realists not as some forum for maritime safety. No, it's seen as India's attempt to collectively balance against surging Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific.
Let's dive deeper into the security dilemma along the LAC, because this is the realist mechanism that explains the perpetual grinding tension.
The LAC is the world's perfect laboratory for the security dilemma. I mean, consider China's intense investment into dual-use infrastructure.
Roads, rail links, airfields.
All-weather roads, rail links, airfields, underground shelters, high-speed fiber optic lines all along the border. From Beijing's perspective, this is purely for defensive logistics.
To them, it's about territorial control, rapid troop deployment in an emergency.
And improving the lives of its border inhabitants, all defensive.
But India reads those dual-use facilities as inherently offensive. A road that can transport aid can also transport tanks.
Precisely. India interprets this buildup as enabling quicker mobilization for offensive action, and therefore it's inherently threatening.
So India responds in kind.
It has to. It accelerates its own defense spending, deploys advanced surveillance and weapons systems, and builds its own strategic roads and tunnels, sometimes using emergency financing.
And then China sees that.
Exactly. China, observing India's response, views the Indian deployments as a hostile escalation, which in turn justifies its next round of buildup, perhaps deploying more advanced artillery or missile systems.
It's a closed loop where action equals reaction and security never actually improves.
The central tragedy of the security dilemma is that both sides genuinely believe their actions are purely defensive, yet the net result is always higher tension and a greater risk of miscalculation. The 2020 Galwan clash, which occurred over infrastructure development, was the ultimate outcome of this unchecked dilemma.
And this rivalry extends beyond the Himalayas, doesn't it? Into the maritime domain, which realists view through the lens of strategic encirclement in Section 3.3.
The concept of strategic encirclement is central to how New Delhi interprets China's grand global initiatives, specifically the massive infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI.
It's viewed with profound suspicion in India.
It is, not as an economic development plan, but as a long-term strategic power projection tool.
And the key component here, from India's perspective, is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC.
CPEC is considered the most direct threat because it crosses territory Gilgit-Baltistan that India claims as its own.
So it's a sovereignty issue.
It is, but realists argue that CPEC is not just about bringing Chinese goods to the Arabian Sea. It is about establishing strategic connectivity. Most critically, it provides China with access to the deep-water port of Gwadar in Pakistan.
Which India sees as part of a bigger plan.
Yes, a concrete element of China's string of pearls strategy, a necklace of Chinese-influenced ports across the Indian Ocean, aimed at achieving critical access and potentially projecting naval power into a region historically considered India's sphere of influence.
So realists just strip away the economic rhetoric and see pure geopolitical maneuvering.
That's right, for influence and access.
So if realism predicts this constant, fierce rivalry, why haven't these two giants gone to a full-scale conventional war since 1962? Section 3.4 brings up the ultimate constraint.
Nuclear capability. The nuclear dimension is the great stabilizer, ironically. Realism, while predicting intense competition, also acknowledges the constraint of mutual nuclear deterrence. Both nations are declared nuclear weapon states.
And they're operating under the assumption of mutually assured destruction, or MAD.
Which increases caution exponentially.
Yeah.
It absolutely does. The realization that even a limited conventional war could escalate to the nuclear threshold increases the caution surrounding border skirmishes.
So what does realism predict for the long term?
It predicts a pattern of managed rivalry, intense competition, and coercive pressure, but careful containment of conflict below the threshold of full-scale war.
And for India, what does that mean for its policy?
For India, this realist calculation means policy must prioritize maintaining credible nuclear and conventional deterrence, accelerating military modernization, and continually solidifying strategic partnerships like the Quad and bilateral defense ties with nations like France and Russia. It's all about balancing the structural strength of China.
Okay, we've established the foundation of the hard security rivalry thanks to realism. But we still need to reconcile that with the staggering level of economic integration. That requires the liberal lens in Section 4.1. How does liberalism account for the cooperation floor in this rivalry?
Liberalism highlights the dense web of institutional relationships that provide that floor for cooperation. India and China are co-members of the WTO, which governs their trade practices.
And they cooperate in other forums.
Critically, they collaborate in forums like BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and the G20.
And these aren't just symbolic memberships. Where do they find common ground?
They often align on issues related to global economic governance. Within BRICS and the G20, for instance, they frequently push for the reform of existing global financial and political institutions like the IMF or the UN Security Council.
Arguing for a greater voice for developing nations.
Exactly. They share the common goal of challenging Western dominance in the global order, which allows for substantial cooperation on things like development finance and climate diplomacy. These act as essential shock absorbers for the bilateral friction.
And of course, the economic links themselves act as a powerful constraint.
Absolutely. The rapid expansion of trade since the 1990s, especially in complex sectors, is key. Indian manufacturing depends heavily on Chinese imports of intermediate goods, electronics, active pharmaceutical ingredients, capital machinery.
A deep, dense linkage.
Very deep. And it raises the cost of open war so high that liberal theory suggests it gives political leaders an overwhelming incentive to control border crises and seek diplomatic resolutions, even when tensions flare. The business community in both nations becomes a powerful lobby against military escalation.
That said, Section 4.2 brings us to the critical counterpoint, the limits of interdependence. The 2020 Galwan clash proved that economic ties are not an automatic guarantee of political stability.
Galwan was the critical test case. It exposed the limits of pure liberal optimism. The reaction was immediate and comprehensive.
What happened?
Following the clash, India imposed sweeping non-tariff restrictions that directly targeted China's economic power projection.
Can you elaborate on the scale of those
It
restrictions?
wasn't minor regulation. I mean, India banned hundreds of popular Chinese mobile applications, including TikTok and WeChat, citing national security concerns.
Wow.
They tightened investment screening mechanisms significantly, scrutinizing all incoming foreign direct investment from contiguous nations, which heavily impacted Chinese capital flows.
And it went further.
Yes. They restricted Chinese participation in critical national infrastructure like 5G network development and power sector projects.
That's a massive economic reaction to a military skirmish.
It is. It showed that economic tools are now fully integrated into realist statecraft. The insight here is crucial. Economic interdependence does not automatically prevent political conflict.
So what does liberalism say you need?
If political stability is the goal, liberalism dictates that you must have stronger, binding dispute management mechanisms and deeper, formalized institutional engagement like mandatory arbitration or robust trade rule enforcement to prevent security fears from overriding economic rationality. If the institutions are weak, realism wins.
Which transitions us perfectly to constructivism in Section 4.3, because this theory explains why security fears are so easily triggered and amplified, even in the face of shared economic benefit. It's all about identity and narrative.
Exactly. Constructivism argues that the national identities projected by both states are fundamentally incompatible and competitive.
How so?
China increasingly constructs its identity as a great civilizational state. It views itself as the undisputed, natural, and inevitable leader of Asia, reclaiming its historical centrality. This framework leaves very little room for a pure competitor.
And how does India frame its identity in response?
India constructs itself as a democratic, plural, and independent pole of power. It explicitly positions itself as a leader and representative of the global South.
And by stressing its democratic values.
It subtly challenges China's authoritarian model of leadership, creating an inherent ideological friction that colors every single diplomatic interaction.
And we keep coming back to the ghost of the 1962 war.
And rightly so. The memory of the 1962 war is perhaps the most powerful constructivist anchor. As our sources emphasize, it's often narrated in India as a profound betrayal after Hindi Chini bye-bye.
This is not just a historical note.
No, it's an emotional narrative. It permeates public opinion, it influences national media discourse, and it makes it incredibly politically challenging, often impossible, for any Indian government to appear conciliatory or weak on border disputes.
And on the Chinese side, the narrative is equally hardening around concepts of non-negotiable sovereignty.
Absolutely. Chinese domestic narratives stress unwavering territorial integrity and their core interests, particularly in sensitive regions like Tibet and the border areas. This narrative is constantly reinforced by state media, creating a domestic expectation that prohibits the leadership from making concessions on territory.
Which makes diplomatic resolution extremely difficult.
Even if it might be economically rational.
And this helps explain the rapid escalation during incidents, which is the key insight of Section 4.4, narrative hardening.
Right. When an incident occurs along the LAC, constructivism explains how media coverage, combined with the immediate and widespread surge of social media nationalism on both sides, quickly hardens positions.
The discourse changes.
The political discourse uses the language of national honor and historical betrayal, transforming a localized skirmish into a national crisis that demands a firm, non-conciliatory response. And that overrides the cooler heads favored by liberalism.
But if identity and norms are constructed, they can be changed. Does constructivism offer any flicker of hope for breaking this cycle?
It does, but it requires a deep, sustained effort. The path to long-term change, suggested by this theory, relies on the emergence of new shared ideas or superordinate goals.
Like what?
Think concepts like an Asian century defined by cooperative growth, or a multipolar Asia where power is distributed and stable, moving away from the binary rivalry.
But that requires backing by concrete efforts.
Massive academic exchanges, expanded tourism, cultural partnerships, and robust people-to-people contacts designed to gradually erode the entrenched narratives of mistrust and replace the memory of betrayal with the new, shared experience of constructive engagement.
This is the critical transition. We've used the theories to understand the abstract geopolitical forces, but how do these deep insights translate into concrete corporate risk and strategy? I mean, for multinational enterprises, for global investors, this is where the rubber meets the road for you, the learner.
It is the essential bridge. For global firms, understanding which theory is dominant at any given moment helps them price risk, design supply chains, and approach marketing.
Let's start with the hard-nosed realist business strategy in Section 5.1. What does the realist view demand of the multinational corporation?
Realism demands that businesses abandon the assumption of purely free markets. They must recognize that states will not hesitate to use economic tools.
Tariffs, sanctions.
Tariffs, investment screening, export controls, technology bans as primary instruments of strategic competition. For the realist, the global economy is merely an extension of the state's security apparatus.
And the practical result of that is the mandatory strategy we now hear discussed in every boardroom. China plus one.
That phrase is the direct manifestation of realist geopolitical risk assessment. Firms are no longer willing to concentrate production in a single country that is constantly engaged in a security dilemma with its largest neighbors.
So they're shifting manufacturing and sourcing out of China.
And into alternative locations, with India and Southeast Asia being primary beneficiaries.
Are we talking about specific sectors here?
Absolutely. We see this most clearly in high-tech electronics assembly, where assembly lines are being replicated in India and Vietnam. We see it in the pharmaceutical sector.
Right, the pandemic exposed the risk there.
Exactly. The risk of relying entirely on China for raw materials like active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs prompted diversification into Indian and other global suppliers. The goal is building systemic resilience.
But diversification costs money. Realism implies that companies must now build specific political risk scenarios around these things.
They have to. Border incidents, technology bans, sudden regulation changes. This requires major capital expenditure. Companies must invest in incredibly flexible, modular supply chains that can pivot immediately.
So risk management is now geopolitical modeling.
It is, modeling the financial impact of a border clash resulting in an immediate national boycott of their products, or a sudden government regulation that mandates a local partner or restricts data flow across borders. Realism transforms supply chain efficiency into a geopolitical liability if it's not managed proactively.
Okay, shifting to Section 5.2, the liberal business opportunity. When tensions are managed, what opportunities does liberalism highlight, especially for companies seeking vast scale?
Well, when the relationship enters a stable phase, often facilitated by multilateral rules through the WTO or BRICS, the liberal view highlights the massive opportunity of accessing both markets simultaneously.
So the focus is on the combined potential.
Yes, on India and China as central pillars of global growth.
So global firms are still forced to participate in both markets, but the strategy has to be highly nuanced.
It does. The strategy demands structuring investments that strictly respect both countries' regulatory and security concerns. For example, a company might sell Chinese manufactured goods into India, but it must adhere to Indian standards on local data storage and security screening for its telecom components.
So leveraging the games while navigating the politics.
Exactly, through institutional adherence.
Finally, we have the most subtle but perhaps most immediate application, the Constructivist marketing challenge in Section 5.3.
And this is where identity politics directly impacts the balance sheet. Constructivist insights remind businesses that identity politics and nationalist campaigns, like widespread calls to boycott foreign products, often fueled by social media after border incidents, can severely and instantly affect brand perception and consumer behavior.
We saw this after the Galwan clash, when brands with any perceived Chinese association faced intense public backlash in India.
It was devastating for some. When the political narrative hardens and nationalism surges, firms are forced into sensitive, costly strategies. They're pushed to aggressively localize everything.
Their branding, Their leadership.
Their branding, their executive leadership, their partnerships, their communication, it goes beyond mere regulatory compliance. They must demonstrate clear, visible sensitivity to each country's specific narratives on sovereignty, self-reliance, and national development.
So ignoring these deep-seated cultural and historical narratives is a recipe for commercial disaster.
It is. Constructivism teaches that perception can destroy profitability faster than a tariff.
So to synthesize what we've learned, the India-China relationship is a dynamic tapestry that really demands all three lenses simultaneously. You can't just rely on one theory.
No, you can't. It's the constant interplay that defines the relationship. Realism explains the enduring structural security rivalry, the competition for regional power dominance, and why border tensions persist despite decades of diplomacy.
And liberalism.
Liberalism highlights the indispensable importance of economic interdependence, shared institutional spaces like BRICS and trade ties, but it also shows their fragility when those core strategic interests, the realist concerns, are fundamentally threatened.
And constructivism ties it all together with the why.
Exactly. Constructivism explains why deeply rooted identities and historical memories, specifically the trauma and narrative of the 1962 betrayal, maintain high levels of mistrust, allowing minor incidents to quickly escalate into national political crises.
So what does this constant mix of rivalry and engagement mean for policymakers in New Delhi and for global business leaders today?
For policymakers, the combination of perspectives necessitates a finely tuned dual strategy. They have to walk and chew gum at the same time.
How so?
They must maintain credible military deterrence and solidify strategic partnerships, addressing the realist threat head-on with strength. Simultaneously, they have to actively use trade, multilateral forums, and confidence-building measures along the LAC to keep competition contained within manageable, predictable boundaries.
Which satisfies the liberal agenda.
Right. The goal is to compete without collapsing into chaos.
And for global business, the takeaway is that risk analysis must become geopolitical.
It must. The India-China relationship will remain a persistent, unpredictable mix of massive opportunity, because these are two giant markets, and severe strategic risk. This demands essential, proactive geopolitical awareness at the highest executive levels.
It demands the China plus one strategy.
Mandatory supply chain diversification, costly but necessary and carefully localized country-specific commercial strategies that respect the powerful, shifting local narratives.
What a dense but illuminating deep dive. We started with the intense friction of the 1962 war and ended with the strategic choices facing global firms today, all thanks to applying this theoretical toolkit of IR to this complex rivalry.
The theories truly give us the structure to understand why one of the world's most dynamic economic relationships is simultaneously one of its most critical security flashpoints. The challenge is in the dual management of risk and opportunity.
Absolutely. And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to explore on your own that builds on that constructivist perspective. If this theory suggests that shared ideas, like the concept of a truly cooperative Asian century or a stable multipolar Asia, could facilitate long-term change, what specific practical people-to-people exchanges beyond just high-level commerce and diplomacy, or what specific academic and scientific collaborations could practically be implemented to truly shift the narrative away from that deeply entrenched memory of the betrayal after Hindi Chini Bye-Bye?
Can a new shared story be constructed that overrides a half-century of mistrust? A fascinating and crucial question for future generations of leaders and citizens in both nations.
Thank you for sharing your comprehensive source material with us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.